The moment Bishop Paul Morton stepped to the pulpit for the last time, you could feel it. The air shifted. The congregation fell silent, eyes filled with tears, hearts heavy with gratitude. After decades of ministry, leadership, and legacy, Bishop Morton's farewell wasn't just an ending. It was a moment that reminded everyone why he was called in the first place. But what happened next during that emotional goodbye left even the most stoic church members speechless. And you won't believe what Bishop Morton said before walking away from the pulpit for the final time. After more than half a century of preaching, leading, and transforming lives, Bishop Paul S. Morton, the founder of the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship and one of the most influential voices in modern ministry, stood before his congregation one final time. It wasn't just another Sunday service, it was history in motion. The sanctuary, filled with people from every generation, was thick with emotion. As Bishop Morton's voice trembled with both gratitude and heartbreak, this farewell wasn't simply a retirement announcement. It was the closing of a spiritual chapter that had shaped the lives of thousands. And as cameras rolled, capturing every tear and every standing ovation, one could sense that something far deeper was happening, something beyond the walls of the church itself. In this video, we're taking you inside that unforgettable moment, uncovering what led up to Bishop Morton's decision to step down, how his final words moved an entire congregation to tears, and what this transition means for the future of the church he built from the ground up. You'll hear what truly happened behind the scenes, the emotions that many tried to hold back, and the spiritual message that turned his farewell into a moment of divine reflection. Because as powerful as Bishop Morton's goodbye was, there's a story beneath the surface, one about legacy, faith, and the heavy cost of leadership. You won't believe how deeply this moment touched those who were there, and why it's being talked about across the entire Christian community today. Stay tuned, because this isn't just a goodbye. It's a lesson in purpose, humility, and the end of an era. To truly understand the emotion behind Bishop Paul Morton's farewell, we have to go back long before the tears, before the packed sanctuary, and before the farewell speech that moved the world. Bishop Morton's story begins with a young man who dared to believe that ministry could be more than tradition, that it could be transformation. Born in Canada in 1950, Paul Sylvester Morton was raised in a home where faith wasn't just spoken, it was lived. His father, Bishop C.L. Morton Sr., was a powerful preacher and leader in his own right, and young Paul grew up watching what true spiritual leadership looked like. But while many might have been content to simply follow in their father's footsteps, Paul had a vision that would expand far beyond what anyone imagined. When he began pastoring in New Orleans, Bishop Morton was young, passionate, and unafraid to challenge the limits of what the church could be. He believed that ministry wasn't meant to be confined by old systems, that worship could be free, expressive, and alive. In a time when many churches were resistant to change, Bishop Morton boldly embraced innovation. He introduced new music styles, encouraged open expressions of worship, and connected with people in a way that made faith feel personal again. This approach caught fire. Under his leadership, Greater St. Stephen Missionary Baptist Church transformed from a small local congregation into one of the most influential churches in America. Services were packed, music was electrifying, and the message of grace, excellence, and empowerment spread like wildfire. Soon, people across the nation were tuning in to hear Bishop Morton preach, not because he was flashy, but because he was real. But Bishop Morton's impact didn't stop at one church. In 1994, he founded the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship, a movement that would go on to change the face of worship around the world. The idea was simple yet revolutionary: to give churches rooted in Baptist tradition the freedom to embrace the full power of the Holy Spirit. That vision broke barriers and built bridges, attracting pastors and congregations from every background. Under his leadership, the fellowship became a spiritual home for thousands of leaders, including many of today's most recognized pastors, gospel artists, and ministry figures. Through conferences, worship gatherings, and leadership summits, Bishop Morton became more than a preacher. He became a mentor, a father figure, and a voice of balance in a generation hungry for both truth and power. Over the decades, his influence extended far beyond the pulpit. His music ministry through hit songs like Let It Rain, I'm Still Standing, and Bow Down and Worship Him became the soundtrack for worship services across the globe. His ability to merge powerful preaching with anointed music made him a beloved figure not only in church circles, but also in the gospel music industry. And yet, behind the global recognition and ministry success, Bishop Morton carried a quiet humility. He often said that his greatest joy wasn't in numbers or fame, but in seeing people come to know Christ more deeply. He poured his heart into raising new leaders, empowering younger pastors, and reminding them that true ministry is about servanthood, not status. That's why when word spread that Bishop Morton was preparing to retire, it hit the church world hard. For many, it felt impossible to imagine the fellowship or Sunday mornings without his voice, his energy, and his unwavering faith. People began to reflect on how much his leadership had shaped not only churches, but entire generations of believers. And yet, as the anticipation for his farewell grew, few could predict just how emotional that final moment would be. Because while most saw a celebrated bishop closing a chapter, those close to him knew the truth, that behind the smile, behind the strength, was a man quietly wrestling with the weight of letting go. As the day of his final address approached, emotions inside the congregation ran high. Members from all over the country traveled to witness it in person, some flying in from across the world. There was laughter, celebration, and gratitude, but also an undeniable sense of sorrow. They knew they were saying goodbye to more than a leader. They were saying goodbye to a father of faith. But as powerful as his journey to the pulpit had been, what happened during that farewell service would reveal something even deeper, the heart of a man who had given everything to his calling. The atmosphere inside the church that morning was unlike anything the congregation had ever experienced. From the moment the doors opened, people flooded the sanctuary. Men and women, young and old, faces filled with both joy and sadness. Some carried tissues, others wore expressions of quiet reverence. It wasn't just another Sunday, it was history in motion. The worship team began with songs that set the tone for what everyone knew would be a day to remember. The choir sang Let It Rain, one of Bishop Morton's most beloved songs, and as the voices filled the room, many couldn't hold back their tears. This was the same song that had carried people through seasons of pain, the same anthem that had brought revival to churches across the country, and now it served as a soundtrack. When Bishop Morton finally stepped onto the stage, the entire congregation rose to their feet. The applause was deafening. Some people shouted, others simply stood in silence, hands lifted in gratitude. In that moment, you could feel the weight of 40 years of ministry resting in the room. The man standing before them wasn't just a pastor. He was a spiritual father, a guide, a voice of truth in a world that had changed so much since the day he first took the pulpit. As he approached the microphone, Bishop Morton paused. For a moment, he didn't say a word. He simply looked out across the room at the thousands of faces staring back at him and smiled. But it wasn't the smile of a man who had achieved everything. It was the smile of someone who knew that this goodbye was going to be harder than anyone realized. When he began to speak, his voice carried the same steady authority that had defined his ministry, yet underneath that strength there was a noticeable tremor, the kind that only comes when emotion and faith collide. He spoke first about gratitude to God for sustaining him through every season, gratitude to his wife, Pastor Deborah Morton, who had stood by him through every challenge and victory, and gratitude to his congregation, who had been his family for decades. Then his tone shifted. He began to reflect not on the accomplishments, but on the journey itself. He talked about the struggles behind the scenes, the moments of doubt, the sleepless nights, the times when he questioned whether he was truly making a difference. He confessed that ministry hadn't always been easy, that leading people required a kind of strength only God could give. There was a powerful silence in the room as he said, "I've preached to you for years about faith, about trusting God in the unknown, but now it's my turn to walk by faith. My season is changing, and as hard as it is, I have to trust that God's next move for my life is still good." At that moment, something shifted in the room. You could hear muffled sobs throughout the audience. People weren't just watching a farewell, they were witnessing a transition, a man handing over not just a title, but a legacy. Bishop Morton had always been transparent about his humanity, and that day his vulnerability spoke louder than any sermon. He He went on to share how stepping away from leadership didn't mean stepping away from purpose. I may not be leading from the front anymore, he said, but I'll still be praying, mentoring, and cheering on those who will carry the torch forward. Then, in a moment that caught everyone off guard, Bishop Morton turned his message into a call for unity. He urged the congregation and pastors across the nation not to let division or ego undo what years of love and labor had built. The work of the kingdom must continue, he said firmly. Don't let my retirement be the end of momentum. Let it be the beginning of revival. As he spoke,